All right, so let's do a follow-up. Many of you listening now, watched my interview with Eric S. Reinhardt, who dubs himself the Platonic Atheist. Yeah, interesting guy. Brilliant guy in a lot of ways. Now, remember, if you go back a few months, I had started down this road of presuppositional apologetics, and a lot of you were skeptical. No, we weren't great. Yeah, you were. You could tell the truth. A lot of you were skeptical, and I said I had pointed the philosophy that undergirds presuppositional apologetics is essentially correct. And I told you in no uncertain terms, in plain English, that my version of presuppositional apologetics was going to work. It was going to be a slam dunk, and it was guaranteed. Why? Because it was going to turn a dumbass atheist, a la an Aaron Ra, into someone roughly equivalent to Eric S. Reinhardt. Now you see that I was telling you the truth and I was essentially correct. Why? He found his way on his own. I didn't even have to debate him or argue with him. He got there on his own. Now, in the actual conversation with him, London Theist noticed, and some of you may have noticed, I was trying to get him to offer me a more robust justification for Platonism. He's, like I said, he's a brilliant guy. He probably sensed why I was doing that, so he pulled back from doing it. Why? Because if he had done it, I would have used it against atheism in general. He is what I was talking about. He is the end result of my presuppositional apologetics. Why? Because that is what happens when you have coherent philosophy. A Platonic atheist. Now, he might take issue with this, but I would describe that as someone in between theism and atheism. The Platonic forms, no, it's not quite personal God, certainly not personal God the way he defined it, but they're immaterial, invisible, other than matter and motion. It is not a reductive materialist. It is not your typical naturalist, reductive materialist type atheist. So he was talking about having a debate with Graham Oppy. I would love to see that debate. And if he were going full bore and really trying to justify his position, I would expect and assume, presuppose, if you will, presuppose him to utterly win that debate. Why? Because the Graham Oppy version of atheism cannot be rationally justified. That's the whole point. That's the whole point of what I was trying to point out. Why not? Because transcendent, immaterial, invisible, other than matter of motion, the forms, if you will, cannot be removed from reality itself. In at least mathematics, there are other forms of the transcendent categories that I'm going to unpack. They are there as part and parcel of the nature of reality itself as provable fact. As provable fact, at least in the version of mathematics. Now, some of the other things I've talked about didn't quite come up in that conversation, but they're in the same territory. What I was trying to point out, I was trying to also lead him into, debunking of Hume, which he's done in other videos. There's a Humean line of philosophical inquiry going all the way back to the days of Hume, wherein that type of skeptical philosopher has tried to rule out of the realm of possibility metaphysics, all things transcendent, transcendental categories, and ultimately philosophy itself. It had its logical conclusion in logical positivism, and then logical positivism lasted about 70 years, and because it was so obviously self-refuting, disappeared as a philosophy. Even the guy who founded it ultimately said the real problem with logical positivism is it's false. Yeah, okay. Really obviously self-refuting. But today we have its stepchild, and its stepchild, scientism, is profoundly influential. It is a mainstream position with our scientific community. It is the philosophy that science doesn't need philosophy. Again, really obviously self-refuting too. My philosophy is that we're done with philosophy. Now you can, in the almost every atheist, outside of the philosophical atheist, the Answers from Reason crew, and some people who are thinking more clearly on the topics, like I said, if you start to unpack this properly and think clearly and coherently, ultimately you're going to wind up in a position where Eric S. Reinhardt is, a Platonic atheist. That is something that I am calling in between atheism and theism. Why? Because you cannot rule the Platonic categories out of existence. They already tried, they already failed. That was logical positivism. That's the whole point of it. The only things that are meaning and coherent are things that can be empirically verified for. Now, how many atheists today on Twitter would endorse that statement? Almost all of them. Huge chunk of them. Every single one of them who doesn't do philosophy or doesn't do it correctly. Scientism is a mainstream position. Most of the scientists that you know or heard of are scientism to one degree or another. And it is too a self-refuting position. So much so that I got into another debate with Dr. Matthew Hunt. Yeah, of all people. And like all debates, it lasts about a day and a half. But he was being a scientismist. And his position, basically, he contradicted himself within a series of 12 tweets. Go look at the debate. It's still up there. I'm taking it down. It's a couple weeks ago at this point, maybe 3 or 4 weeks. But he was basically saying philosophy is so boring. I took a class in philosophy once. We're done with that. Oh, so boring. I fell asleep. All philosophers do is talk, talk, talk. We're done with that. It's just science. We don't need it anymore. We have science. As if science is some mystical agent that produces all these results without appealing to anything philosophical at all. And then in a series of 12 tweets, he contradicted himself really badly. He said, how does science do what it does? I think Luke was talking to him, or Joe, somebody, one of the answers from Reason Crew. And he started going, well, science comes up with an intellectual framework. Okay, right there. Right there. I said, what you are doing is you are saying, coming up with the coherent intellectual framework is doing philosophy, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. So that position is self-refuting. That position is self-refuting. My philosophy of science is that science is done with philosophy. Because even when he was talking, he said that science comes up with a coherent intellectual framework. Okay, that is appealing to philosophy. That is doing something that is in essence philosophical. Then he accused me of playing semantics. No, that's not playing semantics. Sometimes words have meaning, and sometimes you use a word to define something correctly, and then you are talking about the exact same process using a different word. But you are still refuting your own position. As if I said, that house is orange. I said, no, it's not orange, Craig. Okay, what color is it? It's a combination of red and yellow. Yeah, orange. That's not semantics. Then he went on to play semantics quite literally in the series of tweets. I swear to God. It was classic, pretty classic Dr. Matthew Hunt. I said, I started telling him that Carlo Rovelli started becoming a philosopher on purpose. And he's done this. He's made videos on the topic. Why did he start studying philosophy on purpose? Because he recognized that he needed to think philosophically, to think in a way different than he had been trained to think, to interpret quantum mechanics correctly. Why? Because the way he'd been trained to think wasn't working. Does that make sense? Now, Hunt correctly pointed out that was a minority position in science. Yes, it is to the great discredit of the scientific community that is a minority position, and the great credit of Carlo Rovelli that he recognized and humbled himself that he needed to think differently in order to truly understand what quantum mechanics was telling us about the nature of reality. The reason why this is going to ultimately prove to be so easy, okay? Philosophy and metaphysics are coming back into vogue. The scientists are starting to use them again. Why? Of necessity born. Just like Carlo Rovelli says, ultimately you can't understand quantum mechanics if you start with the materials presupposition for sure, but unless you start to think different about the data points in a different interpretive framework, think different philosophically. So he tried to train himself to think differently. Now, it's no mysterious coincidence as far as I'm concerned that one of the philosophies that he latched onto, relatively well known in Buddhism, is called the Middle Way. Nagasena, I think, is the guy who made it famous. It's relatively well known. You can look up the Middle Way in Buddhism and you'll get videos just on that topic. But it makes complete sense to me why Carlo Rovelli would have ultimately latched onto that. So you recognize what he did. He said, this is what's going on in quantum mechanics. Okay, my interpretive framework isn't good enough. I need to think differently about the nature of reality itself in order to understand what quantum mechanics is ultimately trying to say about the nature of reality. That is a philosophical thing to do. That is a metaphysical thing to do. Philosophy and metaphysics are coming back into vogue. Why? Of necessity born. Just as I told you, there was a crisis in mathematics that was solved by Gödel's incompleteness theorem, a philosophical proof, mind you. We are currently undergoing a crisis in physics that was started in the 1920s. And how they originally, quantum mechanics was telling us something, the scientific community something really important about the nature of reality. And the first response to it for the last 120 years was basically to kind of shut down. The Copenhagen interpretation is basically, let's not interpret at all. Don't interpret. Just shut up and calculate. I don't want to interpret at all. What's it telling us about reality? I don't know. I don't care. Shut up and calculate. That's basically an interpretation of not interpreting. Now Carlo Rovelli goes, we need to think philosophically and metaphysically in a different way in order to do what? In order to understand what quantum mechanics is telling us about the nature of reality. Perfectly logically, perfectly coherent thing to do. I applaud him for his wisdom and his intelligence. Really wise, really smart thing to do. And he happens to be correct. So yeah, he's a minority position now. Hopefully he won't be. It's to the great discredit of the scientific community that he in fact is. He is leading the way in taking up the charge in a way that is right. As I pointed out, metaphysics, okay? You can't be done with metaphysics. All the term means is beyond the physics. And I gave you a really simple explanation of metaphysics. Some people balked at this. Just because it's easy to understand doesn't mean it's wrong. Okay? You have science, in a sense, Dr. Matthew Hunt is correct. Pure science is agnostic on metaphysics and philosophy. It is, we build a model to predict an outcome. So you have a metaphysical denotation of a pen, set of properties X, a table, set of properties Y. The metaphysical denotation is, we call it a pen. By what? By virtue of its functionality. But to scientists, just builds a model to predict an outcome. Why do we do metaphysics? Two important reasons. First of all, we can't not do it. Like I pointed out, if I ask you how fast is the train going, you automatically metaphysically presuppose relative to the Earth traveling over land. Why? It's the only way the question makes any sense. Beyond the physics, looking for categories beyond what the empirical data tells us to categorize something in a way that makes sense. Otherwise, it's really hard to make sense of things. Just at the simplest level, a pen. We denote it pen by virtue of its functionality. Now, anybody who's thinking that's not metaphysics, there's a really good video on the topic, The Metaphysics of Everyday Objects, by that guy Kane. I think he's an atheist. It's a really good video. It's a lot more complicated than what I'm telling you. So if this is making your head explode, you make my head explode, Craig. It should be. Relax. It's not that complicated. Beyond the physics. At the level of the physics, a pen is just a set of properties. Everybody understands that, right? Okay, so we give it a metaphysic. Why? To make sense of the world. It's a pen by virtue of its functionality. It's got truth value. I go to a store and I say, hey, you guys sell pens? The guy's going to know what I'm talking about. He's going to, yeah, we got some in the back. He's going to go get the right item how many times? 100 times out of 100. Because it has truth value. Can it be empirically investigated for that that's a pen according to some sort of empirical thing? No, of course not. You get it now? It's beyond the physics in a way that's simple, easy to understand. Right? You understand? Everyone understands where I'm at so far? So you can't not do metaphysics. And it's even more important. In the video I posted about the holographic principle, Leonard Susskind, the reason I started going into that. He's the first person to tell you, the physics have already spoken. We know the physics are correct. But he's saying it's akin to a hologram. That is the time for the metaphysician and the philosopher to come in and unpack that and tell us exactly what that means. That's not the physicist anymore. The physicist is done. We know what the physics say. And he says it's akin to a hologram. Okay, what does that mean? That's a metaphysical, philosophical question. Can't be done away with. It can be temporarily sidelined. Why? To shut up and calculate for a time being. But for a curious person who wants to understand the world, ultimately, you got to think philosophically. It means coming up with the correct interpretive framework, even according to the leading scientismist on Twitter, Dr. Matthew Hunt. He said, well, what science does is comes up with the correct interpretive framework. That's words out of his own. Go look at his tweet. He tweeted that exact phrase. That is a philosophical thing to do. Period. Just because he doesn't recognize that as philosophy, he thinks I'm doing semantics. I'm not. That is a philosophical thing to do. That is not a scientific thing to do. That's a philosophy of science. Get it now? So it's coming back into vogue. Now, what's this all got to do with my Sky Fairy? I'm glad you asked. A lot. A lot. Why? The reason why there are so many atheists nowadays, and I only mean this in relative terms to history. Okay, you go back in certain times in history, there was almost no atheists to speak of. But nowadays there's a bunch. But there aren't really all that many. But why are there any? Why there are a bunch is because our society, Western civilization, United States of America, most of Europe, probably a few other places on the globe, teaches each and every one of us to be materialists and scientismists. That is the starting point we were all given. That is what, if you went, even Christians, If you went to a normal American school, they taught you to be a materialist and they taught you to be a scientismist. Why? Because that's how they think reality works. That's the starting point for our entire society. That's why there's so many atheists, and that's why the atheists that you see, okay, this is my own guess, are so overconfident, really confident, and most Christians are somewhat self-conscious. Take someone like Sarah Silverhander. Now, this is just a feeling. I could be wrong about this, but this is something I suspect. Sarah Silverhander, as far as I can tell, is like a really good physicist, correct, or astrophysicist, something like that. Really accomplished scientist. When she tweets, oftentimes, I sense some self-consciousness. Why? Because even in her community, she's being taught materialism and scientism as reality. So when those two building blocks fall, and fall they will, why? Because they are false positions. They are false positions that were taught to all of us. As I said, Dr. Matthew Hunt is a leading scientismist on Twitter. He will contradict himself within 12 tweets, I guarantee it. Just because he doesn't understand what philosophy clearly means, doesn't mean you don't understand what that word philosophy means because you're doing it. So she's sometimes self-conscious, even though she's way more accomplished than almost every atheist that challenges her. Every atheist that challenges is usually a goofball clown, correct? Usually it was just some like half homeless guy. It's like, I mean, some atheists are accomplished, but usually the clowns on Twitter are not. Let's just be real, okay? No, they're living in their vans and they're like barely functional. But they show up all charged up, way overconfident in their position. Why is the question? The question is because our society teaches their position. Materialism and scientism. Most of your famous scientists are scientismists, including like really, really accomplished people, like the black hole dude. I forget, the guy that Leonard Susskind got in a debate with that I mentioned in the other video. Sam Elliott, that's a playwright. I don't even know why that name popped in my brain. I can picture him, the guy in the wheelchair. Everyone knows who I'm talking about, Theory of Everything. What's his name? Anywho, not relevant. So that's why so many atheists are overconfident. That's why this is relevant to Christian atheism. It's really relevant. Why? Because as soon as materialism is debunked, which it will be, why it does not fit the data points. Okay, getting back to Carlo Rovelli for a minute. It's not a big mystery that he latched on to the middle way. Why? It is completely consistent with relational quantum mechanics. The middle way by Arjuna, the Buddhist middle way, is a philosophy that states there is no such thing as a flower, because you can't talk about a flower independent of the ground that it springs out of, independent of the water that the rain that hits the ground and the sun that shines on the whole thing. So there's no such thing as a flower independent of its interactions. That's completely consistent with relational quantum mechanics. At the quantum level, there's no such thing as a particle independent of its interactions. You can't talk of a particle except relative to other particles. That's Carlo Rovelli, almost word for word. So at the macro level, properties hold their values. That's why this gets confusing. That's why materialism seemed to be successful. Why at the macro level, properties hold their values. Materialism presupposes that we live in a world of stuff and that there's a set of objectively verifiable facts over there. That is highly suspect. That is probably not true, but if it's true at all, it's true only at the macro level. At the macro level, yes, properties hold their values. There's a table in front of me, I kick it, ow, it's actually there, it's going to be there tomorrow in the same form. At the quantum level, that is not true at all. Do you get it now? You cannot talk about a particle independent of its interactions. That's why it's so trippy and spooky and mysterious. Where's the particle? We don't know yet. Why? We haven't measured it. We don't know. Why? We haven't interacted with the particle. You think of it that way. So you ask, where's Germany? You have to ask, where's Germany relative to what? How fast is the train going? How fast is the train going relative to what? The question can't be answered absent a reference. The particle is the same way. Where's the particle? We don't know yet. Why? We haven't interacted with it. The particle is now here, what? Relative to a measuring device there or relative to an observer there. It's not that complicated. Why did it take 150 years to get to this point? Because they stopped doing philosophy at around the same time. We're done with metaphysics, we're done with philosophy. Okay, well now you can't make sense of quantum mechanics. Oh, too bad. Shut up, oh, dude. I didn't understand that. We're done with metaphysics, we're done with philosophy. Okay, now you can't make sense of quantum mechanics. Why? Because you need a metaphysician and a philosopher to make coherent sense of the data points. It's all that it means. An interpretive framework and a starting point, a starting point that tells us the nature of reality. Tells us what something is beyond the physics. So a pen is a pen by virtue of its functionality. It has nothing to do with the physics. It's nothing to do with the material facts of the pen. I mean, it's related to it, but it can't be empirically investigated for. Now, how does this all tie together? Because scientism should be dead already. Logical positivism died a long time ago. Scientism is just as self-refuting. It's just as self-refuting. It is the philosophy that science doesn't need philosophy because science is so super important and smart. Doesn't work like that. Okay? Science may be super important and smart, but it still needs a correct interpretive framework or you're not going to do the science correctly. You need to think clearly about what you're doing before you do it. That's all philosophy needs to mean. Come up with an interpretive framework that's logical, logically consistent, has explanatory power, and is parsimonious and coherent and makes sense. That's all philosophy means. You can't be done with that. All it means is thinking clearly and interpreting correctly. That's all it has to mean. Yeah, other people will have other meanings, but that's all it really truly means. And like I said, if you listen to the Leonard Susskind holographic principle, absolute necessity that metaphysics and philosophy is coming back into vogue. Why? Because it's of necessity born. The physics have already spoken. They know that the holographic principle is true according to the physics. But you ask Leonard Susskind, what does it mean about the nature of reality itself? He draws blanks. Why? He's not a philosopher. I don't know. Something. Tell you he's smart and he's good at philosophy. He's the first person to tell you. It's why I posted the video. We're not hardwired to understand this stuff. It's too cosmological and intense. That's basically what it is. It's too cosmological and intense. I can't understand this crap. That's right. That's where I come in. Gregory, and I'll solve it for you, Dr. Susskind. Yeah. Happen to be really sharp. I'll solve it for you. Metaphysician, thanks. I used to know a guy who, I swear to God, I used to go to a party all the time at my friend's house at Flatbush Avenue in Brooklyn. I had like 5 or 6 guys. God help us all. I'm still friends with almost all of them. I'm still friends with all of them, actually. I just don't keep in touch with some of them. But they used to have an apartment, and I used to go there all the time. And there was this guy who had a card that used to come to the party that labeled himself as a philosopher bodybuilder. It was his business card. He'd hand it to you. It said philosopher bodybuilder. It's like hilarious. I just thought that was really funny. That was his job. He's a philosopher and a bodybuilder. It's Brooklyn. It's a fun place. And so, I mean, I guess that's it. What I was trying to tell you, the reason why Stephanie's going to come and kick your ass is going to be very simple. First of all, you're never going to see her coming. Watch this girl. She's a girl. She doesn't know anything about philosophy, science. Laugh my ass off, Stephanie. Then she's going to go, I'm doing precepts. Now I'm really laughing. You know how they trash Stephanie? Remember Stephanie, the babies aren't died. They just relocated. 6 years of that. 6 years. Oh my God, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. 6 years in the running. Something like that. I forget what the exact quote is. They just never let it go. So they'll go, oh, Stephanie, the babies are relocated. That's amazing. So amazing that we'll harp on it for 3 straight years or 4 straight years. So she shows up. And you go, ha. And then she goes, I'm going to be a preceptor. I'm going to do presuppositional apologetics. Laughing my ass off. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to destroy her. She's a girl. She's dumb. She says crazy things. And then, pow! Right in your fat, ugly, stupid little face. That humble pie is going to shove it right in your fat, ugly, stupid little face. Just shove it right down there. Why? Because it's a slam dunk. The logic is borderline irrefutable. Hopefully, Eric S. Reinhardt has a debate with Graham Oppy. You'll see. Why Graham Oppy's position is probably not justifiable. As far as I know, he might have changed, but he's a pretty much strict materialist, reductionist, naturalist in the classic atheist sense. Doesn't work. It doesn't work. Why? Because in order for it to work, logical positive would have had to have been correct. That's where that logically takes you, that line of we're done with metaphysics, we're done with all things transcendent categories. They already tried that and it didn't work. It ended in logical positivism. The fact that the ghost of it is still around in materialism and scientism is the ghost of it is to the great discredit of the scientific community. But that's going to change relatively soon. Like I said, of necessity born. And once that changes, you can quote me on this if you want. Bye-bye atheists. Because a lot of atheists are going to disappear. Why? Because that overconfidence will go away. Part of that overconfidence comes to the fact that most atheists tend to sort of know or think that they're on this page of science. Right? Am I right? Am I right? Everyone's quiet. Yeah. That's why Sarah Sylviander is somewhat self-conscious, even though she's really accomplished and a lot smarter than all the goofballs who challenge her. But the goofballs who challenge her think, and they're sort of correct, that they're on the page that our society says is right as it relates to, they're on the page of the empiricists and the scientists, and they're on the same page as, the people who are building the cell phones. And to a certain extent, they're correct. But that's going to dramatically change. A paradigm shift is coming to science. Why? Because materialism doesn't work. It's over. If you haven't got that from my videos yet, get it. Why? I'm telling you the God's honest truth. There may be a more nuanced metaphysic coming that's in between materialism and idealism, maybe. But if the choice is binary, idealism wins hands down. Why? Because materialism doesn't make any sense with quantum mechanics. It can't be reconciled at all. Like I said, at the macro level, yes, materialism works, properties hold their values. At the quantum level, it does not. They do not. And it's very similar to the Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Just as there is something transcendent to the system itself in Gödel's that needed to ground the system, or mathematics was going to collapse. Why? Because you could literally use formalism to prove a lie. Same principle when it comes to quantum mechanics, materialism, physics. Materialism tells us that there's stuff over there as an objective fact. Okay, that's highly iffy even at the macro level. And that I'm just stuff. And there's nothing transcendent to either of that to ground it. It's ludicrous. Absolutely ludicrous, untenable, doesn't work. And that's why I did that thought experiment, Picture a day where never, I won't even go into it. So, that's how it all ends up. Stephanie's going to come. This is going to be your tagline, Stephanie. Came here for 2 reasons. To kick ass and chew gum. And I'm almost out of gum. Bang. Just like that. Just like that, kids. In the final analysis, be afraid, be very afraid. Why? Because Stephanie is coming, kids, and she don't look happy to see you. That is all for now. The Mass is ended. Go in peace. Amen.